I found out my husband had been turning the gifts from our wedding registry into cash, store credit, and jewelry for another woman when a department store's returns desk called to ask why he had exchanged 11 separate items in the first month of our marriage. My name is Colette Achterberg, and before this happened, I believed I understood the people I trusted and the life I had built. Even now, when I say it out loud, it sounds almost tidy, almost absurdly neat, like the kind of sentence that belongs to somebody else's life. A husband, a registry, 11 returns, jewelry, another woman. But the reality did not arrive in a single dramatic blow. It came to me in pieces, first as a small discomfort, then as a knot, then as a trap closing so slowly I almost mistook it for the ordinary friction of being newly married. Desmond and I had only been married 10 months when the store called, and in those 10 months I had tried very hard to be the kind of wife who believed the best of her husband. We had dated for nearly 3 years before our wedding, long enough that our families knew each other, long enough that our lives had become tangled in the normal ways of shared holidays, shared errands, shared assumptions about the future. He had the calm, competent reputation of a man who looked like he could be trusted with the boring logistics of a home. He was the one who remembered to renew the car registration. He was the one who could assemble furniture without cursing at the instructions. He was the one who, when we were planning the wedding, volunteered to handle all the registry returns and exchanges because, as he put it, "You're already drowning in 100 other little decisions. I can deal with the store stuff." That sounded reasonable to me. It sounded considerate. We had received a generous number of gifts, mostly practical things that our friends and relatives wanted us to have as we started our life together. Cookware, dishes, a stand mixer, sheets, towels, a toaster that my aunt swore would outlive us both. There were also gift cards to a few department stores, and because several people had bought from the registry at different times, we ended up with duplicates of some items: 2 sets of measuring cups, 2 blenders, 2 identical serving platters, a second set of wine glasses from a cousin who had apparently been in a hurry. Nothing strange, nothing worth worrying about. We opened gifts over 2 days after the wedding because Desmond's family had traveled in from out of state, and mine had stayed late after the reception to help us sort the pile in my parents' dining room. I remember the strange, intimate mess of that afternoon: scraps of wrapping paper in a dozen colors, box cutters on the table, my mother making little comments about which serving bowls were beautiful enough to leave out on a counter, Desmond leaning over a stack of cards and reading names out loud with the pleased expression of a man who had already begun imagining our apartment filled with the ordinary symbols of married life. At the time, I felt lucky, not in a dramatic, cinematic way, just in a grounded, practical way. Lucky that we had people who cared enough to buy us things we would use every day. Lucky that Desmond and I had made it through the stress of the wedding without any big fights. Lucky that our new life felt, for the most part, calm. The first month after the wedding was consumed by the usual newlywed tasks. We moved the last of our things into the house we had rented together. I updated my name on accounts. We unpacked boxes we should have unpacked weeks earlier. I wrote thank you notes in long stretches at the kitchen table while Desmond watched sports, cooked pasta, or answered emails for work. I did not mind that he handled the registry returns because he truly did seem to enjoy ticking off small practical tasks. He said the store had a straightforward return process, and he even made a spreadsheet for himself so he could keep track of what had been exchanged and what we had kept. I teased him about being organized to the point of obsession, and he laughed and said one of us had to be responsible. I believed him. If I'm honest, I believed him because I wanted to. Marriage creates a kind of trust that is more fragile than people admit. It is not just trust in a person's fidelity. It is trust in the small architecture of your shared life. That when your partner says he picked up milk, he picked up milk. That when he says he handled the returns, he handled the returns. That when he says he's working late, he's working late. Once you are married, there are 1,000 tiny places where you stop checking. You become less vigilant not because you are careless, but because the whole enterprise depends on that relaxing of your guard. 9 months later, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning in July, the department store called. I was in the laundry room folding towels when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and I nearly let it go to voicemail. I answered because I was waiting on a call from my dentist's office, and instead a woman introduced herself as being from the returns department of the store where we had registered. Her tone was polite, professional, and oddly apologetic, the tone people use when they know they are about to ask a question that is none of their business. She said she was calling about an item still under warranty. A blender, she explained, one of the higher-end models from our registry. There had been a question about the serial number and she needed to verify the purchase history. That sounded routine enough. I told her I could pull out the receipt if needed, though I suspected Desmond had handled the exchange and paperwork. Then she hesitated. She asked if I was Mrs. Achterberg, and when I said yes, she told me she was seeing an unusual pattern on our registry account. 11 returns and exchanges had been made within the first month after the wedding. 11 separate transactions. Most of the value had been converted to store credit. And then, after a short pause, she said that the store credit had been used not for home goods, as was usually the case with newlyweds exchanging duplicate gifts, but for jewelry. I remember gripping the edge of the folding table so hard my knuckles went pale. I asked her to repeat herself. She did, carefully. Gift cards, returns, exchanges, store credit, and jewelry. 3 jewelry purchases, she said, all within a few weeks of the wedding. She could not discuss the details of the items over the phone without confirming account authorization, but she could say the account activity stood out because it was far more frequent than normal, and because the purchases had not seemed to be for household items. I think I said, "That's strange." It was the only thing my brain could find. The woman offered to send me a transaction summary if I wanted to review the activity myself. I told her yes, that would be helpful, then thanked her and hung up. For a moment, I just stood there in the laundry room staring at the dryer as it thumped through a cycle. I could hear the wash machine humming, the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen, and the noises of the house felt strange and far away, as if I were listening to my own life through a wall. My first thought was not that Desmond was cheating. My first thought was that maybe there had been some kind of error. Maybe the store had mixed up our account with someone else's. Maybe one of the returns had been processed incorrectly. Maybe jewelry meant something small and practical, a replacement watch battery or some nonsense I could not yet imagine. I wanted a harmless explanation so badly that I could feel it forming before any evidence existed. But by the time I had folded the last towel, I knew something was wrong. I did not confront him that night. That was not instinct, exactly. It was strategy, though. At the time I did not think of it that way. I knew enough about arguments and enough about Desmond to understand that if I accused him without proof, he would not confess. He would pivot. He would sound offended. He would ask why I was being paranoid. He would insist there had to be a misunderstanding. And if there was any way to turn the conversation into my overreaction instead of his behavior, he would take it. So when he came home, I acted normal. I asked how his day had been. I reheated leftovers for dinner. I listened to him complain about a colleague who apparently took too many coffee breaks. I watched him drop his keys into the bowl by the front door and kiss the side of my head as he passed behind my chair. He looked so ordinary that I almost doubted the call had happened. That was the terrible part. Betrayal rarely looks like betrayal in the moment it enters the room. It looks like the same man who always takes off his shoes at the door, the same grin, the same shirt with the sleeve cuff folded up because he forgot to iron it. That evening I told him casually that the store had called about the blender's warranty. I kept my voice light, almost bored. He looked up from his plate and said, "Oh, that was all. No mention of the returns. No quick explanation. No, right, I handled those. No, I exchanged the duplicates for us. Nothing." I watched him closely. His expression barely changed. Maybe a flicker of attention. Maybe a tiny tightening around the mouth. But nothing that would have seemed suspicious to anyone who did not know what to look for. If anything, the lack of reaction was worse. It meant either he had forgotten using our wedding gifts to buy jewelry, which seemed impossible, or he knew exactly what I was talking about and was waiting to see whether I would let it go. I let it go for the moment because I needed to know more. The next morning, after he left for work, I called the store back and asked for a full transaction history on our registry account. I used my own name and explained that I was one of the account holders and wanted the itemized records for our household files. The representative did not question me. I suspect newly married couples asking for records is not uncommon enough to raise alarm. By early afternoon, I had an email with a detailed account summary. I sat at the dining table with my laptop and opened the file expecting a few ordinary returns. Instead, I saw dates, item names, amounts, and store credit balances that made my stomach tighten. 2 sets of measuring cups returned, 1 duplicate roasting pan, 1 extra wine opener, 1 toaster exchanged, 1 bath towel set returned, a candle warmer, a bread maker attachment, a serving tray, an electric kettle, 2 picture frames, and another blender. 11 separate transactions, all in the first month after the wedding, exactly as the caller had said. The thing that struck me was not merely the number, it was the pattern. The returns were spaced out as if someone had deliberately broken them into smaller pieces. A return here, an exchange there. Credit used in increments. No single transaction was large enough to scream fraud. It was neat, controlled. The kind of thing a person does when he knows he is being dishonest and wants the dishonesty to remain hidden inside otherwise mundane paperwork. Then I reached the jewelry purchases. 3 items. 1 necklace. 1 pair of earrings. 1 bracelet. The amounts were not astronomical in the abstract, but together they totaled just over $4,000, which was more than enough to make me feel physically ill. The descriptions were unmistakably feminine, not unisex. Not something a man might buy for himself or for a relative without needing a second thought. These were gifts. The kind of gifts you give to a woman when you want to impress her, apologize to her, or keep her happy. I sat very still after that, my hands cold on the table. The receipts had been sent to an account connected to Desmond's email address. One purchase had been made in person, 2 had been online. The shipping address associated with the online purchases was not our house. It was a hotel in another city. That detail moved the unease in my chest into something harder. I called the store back and asked if they could tell me whether the jewelry was picked up in person or sent somewhere. The woman on the phone sounded uncomfortable, but she gave me what she could. The items had been purchased with store credit generated through the registry returns, and the shipping details pointed to an address in a city about 4 hours away. She could not tell me more without legal authorization. Legal authorization. That phrase sat in my head like a stone. I was no longer just worried about a confusing store mistake. I was now looking at evidence that my husband had been converting our wedding gifts into jewelry for another woman, and sending those gifts to a different city. I did not yet know whether that woman existed, whether she lived there, whether the hotel had anything to do with her, whether this was an affair or something else grotesque and embarrassing I could not yet name. But the shape of the lie was beginning to emerge. I called my sister first. Nadia has always been the sort of person who can hear 3 sentences of bad news and immediately sort them into categories: panic, suspicion, proof. She listened without interrupting while I told her about the call, the returns, the jewelry, and the hotel. Then she asked me the question that matters most when something is wrong. What do you actually know, and what are you guessing? I knew the store had said 11 exchanges and 3 jewelry purchases. I knew the jewelry had been purchased with store credit from our registry returns. I knew the shipping address was not our house. I knew Desmond had not mentioned any of it when I brought up the warranty call. That was enough for Nadia to go quiet for a beat. You need to document everything, she said. My sister works in accounting, and she has the kind of mind that turns emotion into file folders. She told me not to tell Desmond what I had learned yet. She told me to save screenshots, print the records, and take notes of every conversation we had about the registry from then on. If I was wrong, she said, then there was no harm in being thorough. If I was right, then I needed a record before he had time to rewrite the story. That evening, I searched online for divorce attorneys, not because I had decided to leave him yet, but because I needed to know what I would be dealing with if this became real. One name kept appearing in local reviews and legal directories: Priscilla Nakamura, a family law attorney with a reputation for being calm, meticulous, and very hard to bluff. I sent an email that night and got a response the next morning offering a consultation within the week. When I met Priscilla, I brought everything I had printed: the account summary, the email, a timeline I had started building in a notebook. She sat across from me in a plain conference room, scanned the documents, and did not react with the kind of horror I feared or the kind of pity I disliked. She simply asked precise questions. Had the gifts been registered jointly? Yes. Were the gift cards in both names? Some were. Yes. Did Desmond have access to the online account? Absolutely. Did I have any reason to believe the money had gone into a joint purchase or household use? No. She tapped the receipts gently with one finger and said, "This is not normal registry management." It was such a simple sentence that I nearly laughed. Priscilla explained that the immediate legal issue would depend on whether the returned items and store credits were considered marital property, separate gifts, or some combination, but what mattered first was understanding where the jewelry had gone and whether there was an affair attached to it. If another woman had received the gifts, that would affect leverage, settlement, and possibly whether Desmond had knowingly dissipated marital assets. She recommended I bring in a private investigator if I wanted confirmation before confrontation. I had never hired a private investigator in my life. The phrase itself sounded like something from a movie where people wear trench coats and speak in coded half-sentences. But by then, I had learned enough not to confuse unfamiliarity with excess. Priscilla referred me to Marisol Vance. Marisol was different from the stereotype. She was not theatrical. She was efficient in a way that made everything around her feel more organized just by proximity. She had a practical haircut, a notebook with worn corners, and the kind of voice that sounded like it had no patience for lies, but plenty of patience for facts. When I told her the story, she did not interrupt except to clarify a detail here and there. She asked about the dates of the purchases, the city on the shipping address, and whether Desmond had a pattern of travel or unexplained absences. That last question made me think back through the year in a way I had not done before. Desmond had traveled for work several times, always for client meetings or training. I had never had reason to question those trips because they were infrequent, and because his job did involve occasional travel. He would pack a carry-on, kiss me goodbye, and send the usual texts from airports and hotel rooms. Just landed, meeting ran long, grabbing dinner, back tomorrow. I had taken those messages at face value. Now I remembered that on at least 2 of the trips he had seemed more distracted than usual when he returned, more protective of his phone, more eager to shower and sleep than to talk. Marisol wrote that down. Over the next 2 weeks she worked quietly. I went through my days with the unsettling sensation that the life around me had not stopped at all. I still went to the grocery store. I still answered work emails. I still watered the plants on the porch. Desmond and I cooked dinner together one night and argued mildly about whether the chicken was oversalted. He laughed at one of my jokes and I laughed back, and I had the eerie sensation of standing outside my own marriage, watching the version of me who still believed in it. That in-between period was the hardest part. Once you know something is rotten, waiting for proof makes everything look contaminated. I started noticing little things I had ignored before. The way Desmond angled his phone face down on the table. The sudden conference call that interrupted a Sunday afternoon when he said he needed to take a walk outside. A new cologne he claimed had been a sample from the mall, a receipt in the car from a restaurant in a city that was not supposed to be on his route. Each thing by itself was small. Together they made a shape. I also noticed how carefully I was beginning to observe him. That disturbed me. I had never been the suspicious type. I disliked checking up on people. I disliked the anxious feeling that comes from building a case instead of building a life. But suspicion, once it takes root, changes the way you inhabit every room with someone. You hear the meaning under ordinary words. You notice delays between question and answer. You become a student of the pauses. One night I watched Desmond sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone with a faint smile on his face. He looked almost peaceful, and I felt a rush of anger so sharp it frightened me. Not because he was smiling, because whatever he was reading had the power to make him look like that while I was standing 3 feet away feeling as if I might split open from not knowing. I asked him what was funny. He looked up too quickly. Nothing. Just something from work. It was such a thin answer that I almost pressed him then and there. Instead, I nodded and went upstairs to brush my teeth, and in the mirror I looked like a woman who had been told a secret too large for her body to hold. Marisol called 9 days after I hired her. She asked whether I was somewhere private. When I said yes, she told me she had found the recipient. Her name was Wren. The name landed with an odd force, because it sounded like someone the universe would choose if it wanted to make betrayal feel just a little more lyrical and therefore more insulting. Wren was a former girlfriend of Desmond's, someone he had dated years before we met. According to Marisol, they had reconnected roughly 8 months before our wedding, which meant the affair had started while we were planning the guest list, choosing flowers, and discussing cake flavors. They had not met again by accident. He had sought her out. Marisol had followed the trail through hotel records, credit card statements, and a pattern of purchases that matched the timing of his work trips. The jewelry had been gifts for Wren. The hotel in the shipping address city had been one he used during trips that were supposedly business-related. She found photos, too, not of anything explicit, but enough to establish that they were together. Desmond standing beside Wren outside a restaurant. Wren wearing the necklace from the store records, both of them smiling in the easy way of people who are not hiding from each other. I sat down when she said that. Not because I was weak, because my legs had stopped cooperating. Marisol did not let me drift there too long. She went on to say that Desmond had used the same pattern with other gifts as well. He had not only returned duplicates, he had returned items with no obvious reason except to turn them into value he could redirect. The total amount she had traced was close to $7,000. Some of it had become jewelry. Some had become gift cards. Some had been converted into cash like store credit and then spent on travel, restaurants, and other expenses connected to Wren. $7,000 may not sound life-altering to some people. It was not enough to buy a car or a down payment. But that was not the point. The point was that he had taken the wedding gifts chosen by our families and friends to help build our shared home and redirected them into an entirely separate relationship. He had not merely cheated on me, he had monetized the wedding. I remember asking Marisol whether she was certain. She said the evidence was solid. I asked whether there was any chance he and Wren had just remained friends. She gave me the kind of look people give when they are trying not to insult you while also respecting you enough not to lie. No, she said. Not from what I found. After the call, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The house was bright with afternoon light, and everything inside it looked unchanged. There were still fruit bowls on the counter. The mail was still stacked in a pile by the toaster. Our wedding photo still sat on the shelf near the stairs in a silver frame that I suddenly hated. We were smiling in that picture like people who had been properly introduced to the future. That night, Desmond asked if I wanted to order Thai food. I almost said no, but then I thought better of it. I needed to get through one more evening without tipping my hand, so I said yes. We ate at the table. He talked about a coworker's ridiculous PowerPoint presentation. I pushed noodles around my container and wondered how many times he had sat in a hotel room text messaging Wren while I was at home folding laundry and leaving him messages about the electric bill. I slept badly. The next morning I called Priscilla again. She told me to keep my face still and my information close. The strongest position, she said, was to confront him when I had everything in hand and he could not escape into uncertainty. She would prepare the divorce filing, but I should not let him know yet that I had independent proof. I asked her whether men like this ever admit what they did. She paused long enough that I knew the answer was complicated. They admit enough to protect themselves, she said. You want him in a corner where the truth is more convenient than lying. That advice stayed with me. The days after Marisol's call were some of the strangest of my life because my marriage did not immediately look like a marriage in trouble. Desmond still put his shoes neatly by the door. He still kissed me goodbye in the mornings. He still joked about buying a bigger couch someday. If someone had seen us in the supermarket, they would have thought we were a normal couple arguing about cereal prices and the weather. But underneath every exchange, I could feel the floor shifting. I started making copies of everything: the registry summary, the receipts, the emails, the notes from Marisol. I put them in a folder labeled tax documents because I did not trust myself to keep them in a place that felt too emotional. I also began reviewing old photos and messages. On his work trips, had he called me from the airport or from a hotel room? When he said he was staying late at the office, had there been a gap in his story? It was like replaying a film after learning the ending, except the ending kept infecting every scene. One detail especially bothered me. The necklace. Wren had been photographed wearing it during a dinner trip. Desmond had told me was a late client meeting. I remembered that he had returned home in a cheerful mood that night and said the meeting had gone well. I had teased him for being proud of himself. He had looked at me with the expression of a man who can smile at the person he is deceiving without flinching. At the time, it had felt intimate. Now it felt obscene. I also remembered the wedding itself differently. Not all at once. Just in fragments. The way Desmond held my hand during the vows, his palm warm and steady. The way he had cried a little during the first dance and said he was overwhelmed by happiness. The way he had kept disappearing during parts of the reception, claiming he was checking on the bar or speaking to a cousin. I had not noticed anything suspicious because why would I? But now those absences fit into the timeline Marisol had reconstructed. The affair had predated our marriage. That was the blow inside the blow. If the affair had started after the wedding, the betrayal would have been terrible enough. But this meant that while he was asking me to promise forever, he was already maintaining a hidden connection with someone else. He had looked at me while saying vows that carried the weight of 2 families and an entire future, and all the while he had been preserving a private escape route. The anger that followed was quieter than I expected. I did not break plates or scream into pillows. I moved through the house with a kind of deadly calm. I washed dishes, I answered emails, I made a grocery list, but inside, everything had become crystalline. I was not sad in the soft, tearful way people imagine sadness. I was hurt, yes, but more than that I felt insulted, not because I had been fooled, though I had, because Desmond had taken something that belonged to our community of love and turned it into a secret funding mechanism for his duplicity. The day I decided to confront him, I was unexpectedly calm. Priscilla had prepared a folder of documents and a few notes about how I should phrase certain things if he tried to deny or deflect. Marisol had sent the final report with screenshots, travel records, and a concise summary of her findings. I printed everything and spread it out on the kitchen table the way someone might set out evidence in a documentary. Desmond came home around 6:30. He saw me sitting there and probably knew at once that the atmosphere had changed. Most people do, even when they pretend not to. He asked what was going on, and I told him to sit down. He laughed in that small, uncertain way men do when they sense the room is not theirs anymore. This sounds dramatic. Sit down, I said again. He did. I slid the store transaction summary across the table and watched his eyes move over the pages. The first reaction was confusion, then irritation, then a kind of forced amusement, as if he were about to explain a simple misunderstanding to a very determined child. "You called the store about our registry?" he asked. "They called me," I said. "Why were there 11 returns and exchanges in the first month of our marriage?" He shrugged. "Duplicates, extra stuff, I handled it, and the jewelry." That stopped him. Just a fraction of a second, but enough. He looked at the paper again, then back at me. "What jewelry?" I opened the next page and placed it in front of him. "Necklace, earrings, bracelet, amounts, dates. The jewelry you bought with store credit from returning our wedding gifts," I said. "The jewelry you sent to Wren." The name hit him harder than I expected. Not because he was innocent, because he had clearly believed he could keep her out of my mouth. He said, very quietly, "How do you know about Wren?" It was not a denial. It was reconnaissance. I told him exactly what Marisol had found, including the hotel stays, the travel records, and the photos. I watched the color drain from his face. For a few seconds he looked almost young, which made me hate him more, because guilt had not made him noble. It had only made him smaller. He started talking very quickly after that, the way people do when they realize the story is no longer under their control. "Yes," he said. He had seen Wren again before the wedding. Yes, it had become an affair. No, he had not intended for it to continue. Yes, he knew how it looked. He said the affair had not been serious at first, which is a sentence that has no moral value but is often offered as if it does. He said he had been confused, stressed, unhappy, and drawn back into something old and familiar. He said he thought the wedding would reset him. He said after we married he kept telling himself he would end it cleanly, but then he didn't. He said the registry returns were a way to avoid touching our joint checking account, as though not stealing directly from our bank balance made the theft cleaner. I remember staring at him while he tried to talk his way through it. There is a special cruelty in the excuses cheaters use, when they think technical distinctions will soften what they did. It was not really money from you, it was gift credit. It was not really a relationship, it was just stress relief. It was not really planned, it just happened. It was not really a lie, it was only omission. Listening to Desmond, I realized he had spent months building a private moral accounting system in which every wrong thing became slightly less wrong if he could phrase it carefully enough. "You bought another woman jewelry with our wedding gifts," I said. He flinched. "You used the presents our friends and family gave us to start a married life," I continued, "to buy gifts for your girlfriend." He said he hated that I called her that. That was almost funny, almost. I asked him whether Wren knew he was married. He closed his eyes for a second, which was answer enough, and then said yes. She knew he was in the process of separating. That phrase turned my stomach because it was not only a lie, it was a rehearsed lie, one designed to make him sound more respectable while he conducted an affair under my roof. I asked if he had planned to tell me at all. He said he didn't know. That at least was honest. Then he started crying. Not with any impressive depth, just the shallow, defensive tears of a man who has run out of ways to talk around the problem and is trying to use emotion as a cover. He said he never meant to hurt me. He said he had made a mess of things. He said he loved me. I had the surreal thought that if he had loved me, he would have protected our marriage from the beginning, not built a side life on top of it. I told him to stop talking unless he wanted to hear what would happen next. He wiped his face with his hand and said nothing. I told him I was filing for divorce. For the first time that night, he looked genuinely panicked, not guilty, not ashamed, panicked. People like him understand consequences in the abstract, but when those consequences walk into the room with printed documentation and an attorney's name on the letterhead, they become much more interested in pleading for another interpretation of reality. He asked if there was any way we could work through it. I told him no. He asked if I would at least hear him out before making anything permanent. I said he had already had plenty of time to hear himself out while buying jewelry with our wedding gifts. That line shut him down. He sat there with his hands folded like a man waiting for sentencing. I did not yell. I did not cry in front of him. I let the silence do the work. The next few days became a blur of logistics. Priscilla moved quickly. She explained that because some of the registry funds and returns could be tied to wedding gifts given to both of us, there was a strong argument that Desmond's use of them for an affair-related purpose constituted dissipation. In plain English, he had treated shared value as though it were his personal slush fund, and used it for a purpose entirely unrelated to the marriage. That mattered in the property division. I signed what needed signing. I changed passwords on accounts. I moved important papers to my sister's place for safekeeping. Desmond tried several times to have calmer conversations, which is what people call the stage of a betrayal where they want your pain to become negotiable. He said he regretted the choices he made. He said it was never supposed to go this far. He said Wren didn't mean anything compared to me, a statement so insulting in its logic that I can still feel the heat of my contempt when I remember it. If she didn't mean anything, then why was he buying her jewelry with our wedding gifts? If she didn't mean anything, then why was he traveling 4 hours away to see her? If she didn't mean anything, then why had he built a parallel life around her? At one point he asked whether I had really needed to hire a private investigator. I told him yes, because he had already proven he could not be trusted to tell the truth when the truth inconvenienced him. That answer seemed to surprise him more than the divorce papers. What I had not expected was how much I would grieve the story of the marriage more than the marriage itself. The actual relationship, once stripped of the fantasy, had been smaller than I liked to admit. There had been stress, compromise, occasional disappointments, and some very ordinary affection. But the idea of us had been larger. I grieved the illusion of the man I thought I had married, the version of our vows that made them feel sacred, the future I had pictured in which we renovated the kitchen and hosted holidays and got older together. That version had not existed. He had allowed me to build it while he was elsewhere. I hated that part most of all. Priscilla handled the divorce with a kind of cool precision I was grateful for. She did not let Desmond turn the negotiations into a performance of wounded masculinity. She kept the focus on the financial trail and the factual timeline. When his attorney tried to characterize the registry exchanges as merely practical returns, Priscilla showed how the store credit had been converted and spent on gifts for another woman. When they tried to minimize the amount, she had the itemized records and the hotel receipts. When they suggested I was being vindictive, she calmly pointed out that I was asking for an equitable division based on documented dissipation. I was angry, but I was also tired, and sometimes tiredness is what keeps you from making the mistake of thinking you need to win every point emotionally. I only needed the record to be correct. One day, while the paperwork was moving through the usual channels, I got the urge to call the store myself and ask one more question. I don't know why. Maybe because I wanted a normal voice on the other end of a normal line to confirm that what had happened was real. Maybe because I wanted to hear it once more from someone who had no reason to soften it. The woman who answered remembered me. I asked whether it was common for newlyweds to return that many gifts so quickly. She said no, not usually. Some couples exchanged duplicates, sure. Some used store credit to upgrade one appliance or pick a different color of dinnerware. But 11 transactions in the first month, followed by jewelry purchases, was unusual enough that it had stuck in her memory. She sounded embarrassed, as if she wished she could do more than tell me the obvious. I thanked her and hung up. The next emotional milestone was telling our families. That was awful in a completely different way. People love weddings because they are collective acts of hope. Family members buy gifts because they are investing in a story larger than the couple themselves. To go back and explain that some of those gifts had been converted into jewelry, for another woman felt like walking into a room full of people holding candles and announcing that the house had already burned down. My mother cried. My father got very quiet in the specific way men do when they are trying to stay useful. Nadia became outraged on my behalf in a way that was almost physically warming. Desmond's parents were stunned, then wounded, then ashamed. The people who had sent us thoughtful gifts called or texted with varying degrees of disbelief, and I had to keep repeating that yes, it was real, yes, I was sure, and no, I was not exaggerating. What I remember most about those conversations is not the indignation, it is the embarrassment on behalf of the givers. That is what Desmond had stolen from them too. Not just the objects, the intention, the assumption that a gift for a household would become part of a shared life. Instead, some of it had become a necklace worn by a woman they had never met. One of my cousins asked me if Wren knew about the registry items. I told her I assumed so. Marisol's report suggested Wren had worn the necklace, which meant she had probably known enough to enjoy the benefit even if she had not known the full source. That was hard to sit with. I did not want to turn Wren into a pure caricature. It was possible she believed his stories. It was possible she thought he was separating. It was possible she knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care. I still don't know which is worse. But the reality remained that she had been part of the mechanism by which my marriage was drained of value. Even if she was not the architect, she had been one of the beneficiaries. I spent a few nights trying to remember whether I had ever met her in passing, if there had been some innocuous moment where her face had crossed my path before everything became clear. I never found one. That seemed almost insulting too. She had been close enough to touch my life without ever entering it. When the divorce became public among our social circle, a few people had the predictable instinct to ask what Desmond had said in his defense. They wanted the satisfying quote, the dramatic excuse, the one line that would let them classify the story cleanly. Had he been lonely? Did he think we were already drifting apart? Was it a midlife crisis? Did he and Wren have some tragic backstory? People prefer betrayals that come with explanations big enough to make them seem inevitable. But there was no elegant explanation. There was just greed, appetite, and a willingness to turn the practical tools of a marriage into a private financing system. The divorce settlement was final months later. Priscilla made sure the diverted value was recognized in the property division, which mattered to me less for the money itself than for the principle. I did not want the record to say Desmond had simply made a few mistakes. I wanted the record to say he had used resources from our marriage to support an affair. Exact language matters. It matters in court, and sometimes it matters even more in your own head, where the temptation to minimize is endless. After the settlement, I moved out. Packing up a shared life is a strange experience. You discover which objects are easy to leave behind and which ones are unexpectedly loaded. I left the cookware because almost all of it had come from our registry, and I did not want to turn my kitchen into a museum of the very thing he had tainted. I kept the old blanket from my grandmother and the framed photo of my parents at their own wedding. I threw away the wedding favor box and a stack of decorative napkins I had been saving for no reason. In the back of a closet, I found one of the thank you note drafts I had saved from the week after the wedding, and I sat on the floor reading it with the strange detached feeling that it had been written by someone I used to know. I had thanked guests for helping us build our home. That sentence now carried more irony than gratitude. A month after the move, Marisol called to check in. She said cases like mine often haunted clients in a particular way because the betrayal had been hidden inside something so ordinary. A grocery receipt, a weekend trip, a returns policy. People imagine infidelity as dramatic in appearance because that is what makes it easier to spot in stories. In real life, it often hides inside bureaucracy and routine. That was what made it effective. It piggybacked on the trust people already give to boring systems. She was right. The thing that still unsettled me was how ordinary the mechanism had been. He had not robbed a bank. He had not forged my signature on a wire transfer. He had used the ambiguity around gifts and returns, taking advantage of the fact that no one expects a person to build an affair fund out of wedding registries. That was what made the betrayal so cold. It was not even flashy. It was administrative. Marisol also told me she had seen other cases like it. Not exactly the same, but close. A husband cashing in wedding gift cards for hotel stays. A wife upgrading kitchen items and pocketing the difference for a secret account. A fiancé returning engagement gifts to pay off a private debt. When people think the divorce-worthy act must be huge to count, she said, they miss the fact that many betrayals are made of small choices repeated until the damage is large. I asked her whether she thought Desmond would ever understand what he had done. She gave me a very direct answer. Not in the way you mean. He might understand that he got caught. He might understand that he lost me. He might understand that he should have been more careful. But understanding the moral ugliness of using our wedding gifts for another woman would require him to stop protecting his self-image, and men like him often prefer the self-image. That stayed with me because it was true in the ugliest possible way. Months passed. People stopped asking questions so aggressively. Life developed new routines. I learned what it felt like to come home to an apartment where no one else's shoes were by the door. I learned how quiet a room can be when you are no longer scanning it for someone else's mood. I learned that peace after betrayal is not dramatic relief. It is gradual, and at first you keep waiting for the next shoe to drop because you have trained yourself to expect concealed damage. There were still moments when I would remember something from the marriage and suddenly see it differently. Desmond insisting I not worry about the registry because I've got it. Desmond offering to run errands on Saturday so I could rest. Desmond saying he liked giving me the easy stuff because I worked hard enough already. Those comments had once felt like affection. Now they felt like positioning. He had wanted me to believe he was taking burdens off my shoulders when in fact he was quietly moving money off the books of our shared life. That realization made me angrier than I expected. Not because I thought every kind gesture had been fake. I don't. Human beings are rarely that simple. But enough of his helpfulness had been instrumental, enough of his competence had been camouflage, that I no longer trusted the version of care he had displayed so easily. I also had to confront my own embarrassment. That part is hard to admit because betrayal stories often center the liar, But the person who has been lied to has their own private humiliation to sort through. I felt stupid for not seeing it. I felt stupid for thinking the registry returns were an act of helpfulness. I felt stupid for laughing when he said one of us had to be responsible. I knew intellectually that deception depends on concealment, not on the victim being foolish, but emotionally it still stung. I had to learn to separate being deceived from being dumb. Those are not the same thing, even if they feel adjacent when the shame is fresh. One evening, I was going through old emails and found a message from the store sent just after the wedding, thanking us for our registry purchase activity and reminding us about return windows. I read it twice and then laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the whole thing had become a case study in how ordinary systems can become the stage for extraordinary bad behavior. I still have the thank you notes I wrote to our guests. They sit in a box now, not because I intend to send them again, but because I can't quite throw them away. Each card carries the memory of a person who cared enough to choose a gift for a future that did not survive. My aunt who bought the casserole dish. My friend who gave us the lamp. My cousin who carefully picked out the wine glasses. My father's old colleague who sent a gift card because he could not attend. They all contributed to the material start of a marriage that turned out to be built on a lie extending back before the vows. Sometimes I think about how many of them would have reacted if I had told them the truth earlier. Some would have been furious. Some would have been heartbroken. Some would have offered practical help and then quietly moved on. But all of them deserved better than what Desmond did with their generosity. I also think about Wren less often now, though not never. I do not know what she was told or whether she knew at all that those gifts came from our registry. What I know is that she was not the original injury. She was the destination of it. The original injury was the choice Desmond made to keep a double life alive while asking me to build a marriage with him in good faith. If there is one lesson I carry that I did not have before, it is this. Pay attention to the places where money, convenience, and secrecy meet. People often imagine the biggest warning signs are grand and obvious, but a betrayal can hide inside a store return, a travel receipt, an unremarkable phone call. Anything that feels too mundane to question can be exactly where the lie is living. That does not mean you should become paranoid. It means you should not surrender your right to verify reality when something feels wrong. Priscilla told me that after the case closed, and I have repeated it to friends more than once since then. If the numbers don't make sense, she said, keep looking. Marisol said something similar in her own way. Patterns matter, she told me. People think they're better at hiding than they are. Usually they just get lucky until they don't. Desmond did not get lucky forever. He used our wedding registry to fund gifts for another woman. He thought he was being clever by keeping the transactions small and the explanations ordinary. He thought he could build a private romance out of items meant for a shared home, and no one would ever connect the dots. But the dots were there all along, in the receipts, in the hotel records, in the jewelry, in the silence when I asked about the store call, and he did not answer as an innocent man would have. He underestimated the boring power of paperwork. That may be the most satisfying part of the whole story, if there is one. Not the divorce, not the confrontation, not even the fact that I got the settlement corrected. It is that the truth came from something as unglamorous as a transaction history. All his careful little evasions could not survive the plain logic of dates, amounts, and destinations. The lie was emotional, but the proof was administrative. I have moved on in the ways that matter. I sleep better. I no longer jump when a phone buzzes on the table. I have a new apartment, a new routine, and a quieter relationship with trust. I still believe in marriage, but I believe in documentation too. I believe in keeping track of shared accounts. I believe in asking one more question when something feels off. I believe in the importance of being willing to know the truth, even when the truth is humiliating. And I believe, very firmly, that if a store ever calls you about an unusual pattern of returns on your wedding registry, you should pay attention immediately. Do not let someone dismiss it as housekeeping. Do not let yourself be soothed by the ordinariness of the issue. Ask for the records, look at the dates, follow the money. If someone is using a duplicate blender return to buy jewelry for another woman, the story is already bigger than the blender. That is the story I learned the hard way. My husband did not just betray me. He repurposed our wedding into funding for an affair and expected the bureaucracy of gift returns to hide the evidence. Instead, the same paper trail he thought was harmless became the thing that exposed him. And that is why I still remember the exact words the store representative used when she first called me. 11 separate transactions within the first month of marriage. It sounds like a detail. It was the beginning of the end.